Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, rather. I'm Mark Elswig, president of Mark Elswig Company, Executive Recruiters. We work with advisors at wirehouses, regional and independent firms. I've been a recruiter now for 35 plus years, and I'm from a family of recruiters. And today, we're going to talk about leadership styles of successful teams. And I'm very pleased to have Michael Futterman with us. Michael has an excellent background to address this topic. He's an executive coach. He works with some of the industry's top teams, as well as senior executives at many of our industry's most well-known firms. So, thank you, Michael, for being here. So I want to just give you just a quick background on why I was so excited to do this webinar with Michael about this topic. As a recruiter, as I look out on the industry, I see some firms that are like growing like every year. It's like they're growing exponentially. It's kind of unbelievable. And I see a lot of other teams that are, kind of stagnant. So I guess it seems to me, of course, yes, sales skills, the ability to raise AUM, by cross-selling existing customers, bringing in new clients. Yes, that's of course an important factor in a team's growth. But I think there's another factor, and one that doesn't get quite the amount of attention that it deserves. And I think that other factor is the leadership style of the people who run the teams. And that's why I'm very excited to have Michael with us to address this topic. I guess what they call a housekeeping note. Michael and I are going to chat for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for your questions. And let's just jump in. I'm excited to get going. So, Michael, my first question is, why do you think that leadership style is such a big factor in the growth of teams? Why do you
Yeah.
think it's so
Mark,
important?
thank Mark, thanks for having me here. And I'm excited to talk about this too, because it's been something that I've been passionate about for a long time. And it's not
Hmm.
just style, it's really skill.
Hmm.
Um, and,
Right.
you and I work a lot with financial advisors and people in the financial services industry, but I think that this statement applies to people that are not just in those industries. And it's that people don't join businesses because they want to manage people. Whether you're
Hmm.
an entrepreneur and you started your own business, or you have risen in the ranks in the organization that you might be part of, people, they fall into management. It's not something that people set out to do from the start. And
Hmm.
so, why leadership and management become so important is because what got you here won't get you there. And that's a quote from one of my favorite coaches. His name is Marshall Goldsmith. And the idea there is that the IQ that you have, your skills in doing a particular job, that typically is what gets you the job, and it typically will get you promoted. So people become managers because they're really good at the task that they've been given, and they rise to a certain level, and then the people above them say, "Well, Mike, you did a really good job of doing your particular task. How about you run the group?"
Hmm.
And because that
Hmm.
comes with increased responsibility and increased prestige, and maybe most importantly, increased money, people typically say, yes, I'll go ahead and do that. But they don't necessarily have the background or the leadership innate qualities or skills to do that. And so we've
Hmm.
got training programs and all that type of stuff. So IQ gets you the job. And when you become a manager, the shift becomes more about EQ. So
Hmm.
Daniel Goleman is one of the big voices in the EQ space, emotional
Yes.
intelligence,
Right.
and his research um, says that EQ is twice as important as IQ in the manager and leadership roles. So your technical knowledge and skills are still
Hmm.
important, but in
Hmm.
order to be an effective leader, you have to be better at the emotional intelligence piece. So what is emotional intelligence? It's self-awareness. Goleman breaks it down into five areas: self-awareness, self-regulation, internal motivation, empathy, and social awareness. So self-awareness is about how you feel. like what's
Mm-hmm.
going on for you. Self-regulation is the ability to then manage those feelings, those emotions that people have.
Mm-hmm.
The internal
Mm-hmm.
motivation is that ability to get up and have drive and resiliency and tenacity to pursue a goal day in and day out.
Mm-hmm.
Empathy is the ability to recognize other people's experiences and be respectful and aware of what they're experiencing, and that also
Mm-hmm.
feeds into social awareness, which is being able to go into a social environment and recognize that this is a quieter place. To make it very simple, it's either an
Mm-hmm.
extroverted environment or an
Mm-hmm.
introverted environment, and
Right.
learning how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it no, so it sounds like those skills that Daniel Goldman identified as emotional intelligence. It sounds like those are critical ingredients uh, toward being a good leader.
Yeah. And when you look at performance, so I'd like to
Mm-hmm.
do these webinars can sometimes be, you and I are talking at our audience and the people who are
Right.
listening,
Right.
and people who listen to the recording. So I'd like to do an
Sure.
experiment or an
Mm-hmm.
activity with the people that are listening now. So for those of you that are out there listening, you can use the webinar chat to enter your answers to the questions that I'm going to ask you. People often say, as a coach, people come to me and say, yeah, look, all that matters is the bottom line, right?
Mm-hmm.
In business, in particular in financial services, people say, well, did it move the needle? Did we
Mm-hmm.
get, increased velocity and revenue? Did we get higher numbers on our AUM? Are we growing, at the rate that we should be? Are we making enough profit? All of those things. And that's what they look at because those are measurable things. I argue that being a good boss or a bad boss, this idea of EQ, is
Mm-hmm.
just as impactful. So I want everybody in the audience to think of two different people that they
Mm-hmm.
may have had in their careers. So the first person I want them to think about is the best boss, manager, or
Mm-hmm.
bosses or managers that they have had. You don't have to just think of one person. You can think of many people
Mm-hmm.
that might have been really great.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want you to think of the opposite. I want you to think of the people that were really challenging to work for that you really couldn't
Mm-hmm.
wait to not work for them. So you got a good boss
Right.
and a bad boss, right? Mark, are you thinking
Mm-hmm.
about, I know you've been
Yeah.
in business with yourself, so maybe you're the good boss and bad boss for you, but
Right.
think about that. And now imagine, what was it like? What are the words that you would use to describe um, how, uh, what it was like to work for a good boss or a bad boss? So for the good boss, what did they do? What did the good boss do that made them a good boss?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's think about that because I, of course, myself worked for other people for a while
Yeah.
before starting out on my own. But that's something to think about. And let me go into let me look in the queue here. And as people send in, let's give everybody a moment to think this through, and then I'm going to
Yeah, we
report
don't,
on
we don't, I don't
we
want
get it.
people to overthink it. This is really kind of a visceral activity. I want people to just say, like, what did somebody do that made them a good boss? So for Mark, what did these other people do that made them a good boss?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Do you want me to give you the audience response, or I could, or my own?
Yeah, if there's responses from the audience, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah. Yeah, because here's one. This is someone commenting on a good boss. So the good boss was someone who cared about what I felt and
Mhm.
wanted me to succeed.
Okay, great.
And that was how that's how this person defined a good boss.
Yeah. So some of the things that typically come up when I do this
Mm-hmm.
activity in a room
Mm-hmm.
of many many
Mm-hmm.
people, they'll
Mm-hmm.
say they cared about how I felt. They took interest in my development. They gave
Right.
me challenging assignments, but provided me with support. They were always there to help me develop as a human being. They saw me as more than just a cog in the system. Let's look at the other side of
Right.
the equation. What are the things that made somebody a bad boss? So the things that we typically hear when we ask that question,
Mm-hmm.
the bad boss side of the equation is they took credit
Mm-hmm.
for stuff that they didn't do. They were a micromanager. They didn't really care about me. They didn't ask me about my life and who I was as a human being. Um, they were they were volatile, meaning
Mm,
that
right.
they didn't have a consistent sort of behavior, right? So good
Hmm.
boss and bad boss. This is all this is what those people did. So now the next
Hmm.
question that I ask people is, okay, so if you had a good boss,
Hmm.
how did you feel
Right.
working for that good boss? What were the feelings that you had? So, Mark, maybe you can
Hmm.
think about the good bosses that you've worked for. What did
Oh,
you feel working for them?
it's easy. The good bosses that I've worked for, I did the absolute best job that I could do. I was
Yeah,
very, very motivated and as productive as I possibly could be
sure. Yeah.
because I liked them
Yeah.
and I
And so
knew they wanted to help me.
yeah. So what you're moving towards there is actually my third question, which is what did you do? But an important step of this equation is really reflecting
Hmm.
and saying, okay, so what did I feel working for
Hmm.
that good boss? So people say, I felt empowered, I felt
Right.
engaged, I felt accountable, I
Hmm.
felt challenged, all of
Hmm.
those things. And if we look at the bad boss, I
Hmm.
felt threatened, I felt vulnerable, I felt demotivated, I
Hmm.
felt angry and resentful. So these are just
Hmm.
feelings that people have. So people often say, like, all that stuff you do, Mike, it's all feelings. It's hard to measure it. It's all touchy feely
Hmm.
stuff. That's fine. I'm going to prove to you that it's not. So now what you've
Hmm.
got is you've got behaviors by the boss,
Hmm.
feelings that you have. And now the third step is what did you do? And you've already said for a good
Hmm.
boss, you would extend yourself further. You
Right.
would stay later. You would work harder. You would take
Right.
on more responsibility, even without the promise
Hmm.
of higher pay or greater opportunity, right? You would go
Right.
that extra
Right.
yard.
Right.
You would stick
Right.
around in a business even without promotions or
Right.
more
And you,
financial
right.
reward.
Right. And even if you could make a little more somewhere else, you might stay where
You might stick around.
you might stick
Right.
around. Right.
Yeah. So then if you
Absolutely.
look at the bad boss side,
Hmm.
what I've heard, I mean, the worst thing that I've ever heard is that one audience member, when I gave this activity, they said, I actively tried to sabotage the team or the boss, right?
Wow.
So people leave,
Yeah.
they they quiet quit, which is a lot of things that we're hearing about in the last couple of years.
Right.
They don't give their best effort. Those have bottom line impacts. Mark, you probably know as well as anybody else. What is the bottom line cost
Hmm.
for replacing an employee?
It's a lot, and it's very hard to replace good employees. It's
Right?
very difficult. Sucks your time away, and it's very difficult.
Yeah. So these are real bottom line impacts. So when people
Hmm.
argue with me that the idea of emotional intelligence or the behavior of the manager, it's all feelings and whatnot. Just get your, the idea that just get your work done and don't bother me. It's BS. There's a direct correlation between employee satisfaction, the manager's behavior, and the bottom line impact to an organization. So the takeaway from this is that
Hmm.
people don't typically uh, join organizations or start their careers to become managers of people, in particular financial advisors. I have not yet met a financial advisor who became a
Right.
financial advisor because they wanted to manage people. And it can be trained, but there has to be a focus and energy and willingness to do it and to learn how to do it.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the importance of EQ and the behavior of the manager.
Right. But I think your central point is exactly right. Feelings have consequences. And if your employees are going to have negative feelings, the first recruiting firm I ever worked for was a miserable experience. I was gone. Remember, it was 6 months or 8 months, but I didn't stay there very long. So,
Yeah,
the feelings that your employees have real world consequences. So
they do.
I think that's a very good point. Um, are there studies that people have done that uh, that describe what makes an effective leader?
Yeah, there have been a ton of studies, and the studies
Right.
continue. I'm in fact I'm currently doing some research with top leaders to understand um, what their leadership influences are and how
Mm-hmm.
they use those prior influences to guide their
Mm-hmm.
behavior today. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the most notable study, the one that I think that
Mm-hmm.
has a real
Mm-hmm.
lot of data behind it and that I love is
Mm-hmm.
the Project Aristotle study that was done by Google.
Mm.
And what they did is they looked at all these different teams through Google, and you can look at this online. It's called Project Aristotle.
Okay.
And they analyzed like all of these different components of teams. Were they introverts? Were they extroverts? Did they eat lunch together? Um, were they all men or all women, or were they mixed, or, all
Mm-hmm.
of these data points. And Google's pretty good with data.
Mm-hmm.
And what they came up with was pretty interesting. There were um, really five characteristics that
Mm.
identified the outperforming teams. And those characteristics were psychological safety was absolutely the number one thing. And what that means is that people were willing to be vulnerable. And vulnerability doesn't mean weakness, but people were willing to raise their hand and say, I need help, or I don't
Mm-hmm.
understand this,
Right.
or I have a different opinion and I want to
Mm-hmm.
talk about that and not
Right.
feel that they were going to be shut down. So psychological safety goes back to EQ. It's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two was dependability, so that people would do what they say that they're going to do, and there were no backroom deals or sort of a erosion of trust through inconsistency. So that
Mm-hmm.
predictability and dependability was another really key aspect of
Mm-hmm.
team functioning and team performance. Boundaries and roles, structure and clarity. What we don't do as much as what
Mm-hmm.
we do was really
Mm-hmm.
important. So defining yourself as a group,
Mm-hmm.
what it is that you're trying to accomplish, who does what.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all really critical pieces. The work, and this became particularly important, I think, for I hear a lot of complaints
Mm.
about the Gen X leaders. So I'm 53, and the leaders that are of my generation and really the prior generation, there's a sense that like the new generation doesn't want to work as hard. All of these kids, the millennials, they don't want to work as hard. I don't necessarily agree with that. What I think is different today is that people really crave meaning. They want their
Mm-hmm.
work to have some connection to who they are as a human being,
Mm-hmm.
and what it is that I do every day that
Mm-hmm.
impacts the outcomes that we're trying to accomplish. So helping to
Mm-hmm.
draw those lines in between my role and the outcome that it creates is a
Mm-hmm.
really important piece. And then the last one was impact, and that is that what we
Mm.
do actually has results. So measuring those outcomes. So
Mm-hmm.
those are the qualities um, that were identified for teams, and you can see very easily that when it comes to EQ plays into all of those things: psychological safety, reliability and dependability and consistency, creating
Mm-hmm.
boundaries and roles and understanding, um, defining for people the meaning of the work and being empathetic and communicating those. Those
Mm-hmm.
all are EQ based characteristics. So
Mm-hmm.
that study is one of my favorites.
Well, no, it has a lot. I can see why it has a lot of like really good information in it. How do you I mean, this is, I guess, the $64,000 question. You
Yeah.
have someone, they're not really a good leader. How do you coach someone? How do you coach someone to help become a better leader? And I just wonder if there are any examples from your own practice that come to mind.
Yeah, well, I can share with you some of the things that I do, and a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
colleagues do in the coaching space. And I
Mm-hmm.
spend a lot of time in training and development. So there are training courses you can go to the Society for Human Resource Management, and there are plenty of leadership training courses you can go.
Mm-hmm.
My original background was with an organization called Outward Bound,
Mm-hmm.
which is all about around self awareness and self challenge in
Mm-hmm.
an outdoor environment.
Mm-hmm.
The National Outdoor Leadership School. These are kind of extreme examples, but really it boils down to a couple key things. Is one is gaining feedback, so
Mm-hmm.
understanding what it is that I do that's effective and what it is that I do that's not effective. Um, and that comes through the source of
Mm-hmm.
360s. I use tools like psychometrics, so Myers-Briggs, DISC,
Mm-hmm.
Colby, or some of the tools that
Oh.
I've used. Um, and then,
Mm-hmm.
helping people to recognize their habits. So the role of a coach, my experience is that it's a combination. What I do is really a combination of pure coaching, which some people
Mm-hmm.
say is never giving somebody the answer, but letting them come to the answer on their own. I don't know that
Mm-hmm.
that's the best way to do it. I
Mm-hmm.
really appreciate coachulting is what I call it. So I'm going to bring my experiences as somebody who's worked in business for 30 years, and also my coaching experience. So facilitating your thought around how can I do this better. So um, that's all. It's all another word for feedback. So there's
Mm-hmm.
the training side of it, where you can go
Mm-hmm.
and get instructional
Mm-hmm.
tips and tricks and habits and things that great leaders do. But then
Mm-hmm.
there's also the practice of doing it and learning from candidly, it's learning from some of the mistakes that you've made
Right.
rather than the successes that you've had.
Right. Right. So I mean, I guess, do you recall a case where somebody was a not really good leader, not, their leadership skills were subpar, let's say, and somehow
Well,
I'm sure you've had a lot of them.
it was part of
I
what I make my living doing is helping those people to become better. But
right.
there are a lot of them. One of them is the idea of self-awareness, I think is maybe one of the critical pieces. So there was a person that I worked with who uh, was really unwilling to be vulnerable. They had
Hmm.
some learning differences. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
qualified to diagnose them specifically, but they had
Right.
shared with me that they had a problem with dyslexia or dysgraphia. They
I
really had
see.
difficulty with the written word. And so what they would do is they would send all of their written communication out to a third party outside the firm that they worked with. So
Mm-hmm.
secretly, they would send it outside and
Mm-hmm.
then get the
Hmm.
edited version back, and they would use that as their own material. There's nothing wrong with
Mm-hmm.
what they were doing, I don't think, on the surface. The challenge was that they were unwilling to be vulnerable with their team. Now, this took time, this took energy, it took money. And the question that we were exploring in that engagement was how can you find ways to leverage the skills and talents
Mm-hmm.
of the other people on your team so that you can be more effective as a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And it's challenging. People get caught up
Mm-hmm.
in their own beliefs about themselves and in their own image. It's again why this idea of what got you here won't get you there
Mm-hmm.
is so resonant for me. Is that we have to change, we have to evolve, and in
Mm-hmm.
particular, this as your organization grows and as you have more and more responsibility for leading and guiding a more complex organization, these skills become not just critical, but really indispensable. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so there are a couple things that I do, just some basic stuff that people
Yes.
can do as leaders, right? Um, I have this concept, and I got it from another person, but it's this idea of um, not just celebrating success, but
Mm-hmm.
celebrating effort. So this is
Right.
one thing that people
Mm-hmm.
can do as leaders, and the reason for
Mm-hmm.
that is um, effort is the thing that we have control over. It's the thing that your staff has control over, and business is very complicated, no matter what business you're in. So
Right.
if you want the best out of your people,
Mm-hmm.
really recognizing the things that they have control over that they're doing well. We can't necessarily control the outcome, but what we
Mm-hmm.
can do is control the effort that we put into it. And I know for a lot of
Right.
people, they say, but outcomes are really important, Mike. And you're right, they
Mm-hmm.
are important. Um, but as a leader, one of the best things you can do is really praise people for doing the stuff that they're putting effort into, as
Right.
long as that effort is aligned with what your objectives are. So that's one thing that I really recommend that people do. Another
Mm-hmm.
thing that I've I've um, I've heard from other people that has been part of my research and studies is this idea of constraint. So, Zuckerberg and Jobs, two
Mm,
people that are wildly successful that I don't
hmm
necessarily recommend that people emulate. But one thing that they do
hmm
is they have a uniform, right? Zuck wears those hoodies, and Jobs
Oh,
had, all of his
sweet.
turtlenecks and jeans made by
Right.
a particular person. He had a closet full of them. Why? Because it's constraint. It allows them to kind of narrow down the choices that they need to make during the day. So the other thing that I help leaders do is identify, I call it the rule of five. So this is what are the five things that I can do every day that are going to help drive me towards success? And
Mm,
these five things, my
mm,
recommendation to my clients is try and do three of them at least. So for
right.
the audience, I'll give you an example. I am constantly prospecting and building a business,
Right.
looking for more people to coach and interview and that
hmm
sort of thing. So what are the five things that I can do every day that I know if
hmm
I do three of them, it's going to drive me towards my goals and my objectives. So
hmm
I try and spend 1 hour without my phone. And this is not one of those hours. I've got my phone here with me, right, just in case. But at some
Right.
point during this day, I'm going to put
Right.
that phone in another room. I'm not going to be near it. I try and exercise for 30 minutes at least. That's a minimum, maybe just walking around the block. I try and drink
hmm
2 liters of water a day. I spend 1 hour prospecting every
hmm
day, cold calling. And I
hmm
spend 30 minutes
hmm
reading a book, a real book, like,
hmm
these old school things like paper,
Right.
books. So I try and spend
Right.
if I do three of those things a day, I know that I'm going to be going in the right direction.
Yeah.
So those are two ideas, right? Celebrate effort, the rule of five. Um, and then, one other thing that I really recommend that people do is um, really asking for feedback on a regular basis. It doesn't mean you have to agree with all the feedback that you get, but really helping
hmm
people by asking them for feedback is another thing that I encourage leaders and managers to do.
hmm
Because it may contain data that you didn't have access to before.
Right.
And the saying goes that knowledge is power. So let's get more data into the equation.
Yes, and that goes back to what you said before about psychological safety, people feeling comfortable giving the leader feedback on what may not be working. So, no, those sound like
Yeah,
great suggestions because they sound to me like good habits that are just steadily moving you in the right direction. And as long as you're moving in the right direction, eventually you'll get there. So that sound like
yeah,
really great suggestions. So let me just open it up for some questions because we're really I guess bumping up against the end, the end of our time. Um, let's see, just wait a second. Oh, well, here's an interesting one. The question basically is when you work with people who aren't really good leaders, do some people feel in some way, do you get resistance to your suggestions? Do some people feel that maybe you're criticizing them or don't understand what they're doing, or do you get pushback? I guess
yeah,
that's the nature of the
yeah.
question,
My
if I
job, my
understand it.
job, yeah, my job as a coach is not to be your friend. My job is to help you move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that has to happen in the coaching engagement or the relationship is we have to come to an agreement on what you want to accomplish. And I like to think of myself as a fairly empathetic and aware person. I think it's part of what drew me to the coaching profession in the first place. But um,
Mm-hmm.
people wrestle with their uncomfortable feelings. And part of the
Mm-hmm.
role of the coach is to help them sit
Mm-hmm.
with those feelings and then come up with methodologies to either reframe them or reinterpret them. And then again, you've got self awareness and then self regulation. So,
Mm-hmm.
an example of this is learning how to be upset without being expressive in being upset. And why is that important? Because it,
Mm-hmm.
it's not to say that expressing your pleasure or your discomfort with something is not okay. The
Mm-hmm.
question is really is my expression of my emotion in this circumstance going to get me the results that I want? So, for example, if I give my client one of the things that we do is we collect feedback, and some of the feedback
Mm-hmm.
is really challenging.
Mm-hmm.
So I provide a space for the client to be very expressive with their displeasure or their uncomfortable feelings about particular feedback. I don't do that. That's
Mm-hmm.
BS, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they can be
Mm-hmm.
explosive and volatile with me. That's fine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Working through that and learning to say, okay, what do I want to take away from this? And how do I want to um, take this information and behave in a different way with the people that are giving me this feedback? So instead of going back and being furious at the
Mm-hmm.
people who are giving me feedback in the interest of helping me,
Right.
I'm going to go back to them and learn how to either be curious or be
Mm-hmm.
grateful or
Mm-hmm.
be open to new ideas and new ways of doing things. So people are resistant, um, but that's part of why hopefully that they're getting a coach is because they recognize that they need help.
Makes sense. Let me just take one more question here. Um, Here's one. When you work with advisor teams, typically
Yeah,
how long, how long does the process take? How long does the engagement? What's the range of, that kind of
yeah.
thing?
So you'll find that out in the marketplace that there are coaches that um, they have a process and a duration that they want to work with people, whether it's 9 months or 6 months, or the engagement length is pre-specified. And I don't think there's
Hmm.
anything wrong with that. The way that I work with my clients is it's a month-to-month basis.
Hmm.
And how long does it take to get results? I think it's a 3, 6, 9 month process. If you work with
Right.
a coach for 3 months, you can typically get some good awareness of where the opportunities and where the issues are. That's
Hmm.
3 months. You gather you define the project, you gather feedback, you provide the feedback, and then you come up with a plan for
Hmm.
acting on it. By 6 months, you should really have a plan of attack and have started to implement some of those actions that you've identified as a result of the feedback or as a result of the conversations that you're having with your coach.
Right.
In
Right.
9 months, you should
Hmm.
be able to see some fruits of your labor. People will start to see change. People will start to see outcomes and results. Now, what I'm talking about here is executive coaching, behavioral coaching, um,
Hmm.
leadership coaching. There are other kinds
Hmm.
of coaching that are out there where people might see this a little bit shorter period of time, but typically that is what I've seen. Really, 9 months until you can see uh, the results. And what I'll offer to people in the audience is part of what I do with all of my clients is and prospects is you get a free coaching session with me. So if anybody here is listening to this, if they want to reach out
Hmm.
and spend 45 minutes with me, there's no obligation, it's free of charge. I'm going to give you the opportunity to get, some benefit out of working with me.
Hmm.
And then we can talk about whether or not you think we'd be a good fit to be a client. So that's
All
an
right, that's
offer to
great.
anybody listening to the webinar.
All right, that's really great. I'm just gonna, for a second, I'll flash your contact on the screen for a
Yeah,
sec.
sure.
But no, but I really want to thank you. I really, not really, actually, I really got quite a lot out of it. I love speaking with knowledgeable people like yourself, and
Dear.
I learned a lot from our session, and so I really appreciate it a lot. And wait a minute, so let me get this down. Yeah, there it is. Good. And yes, and I guess what I will say, I've enjoyed our session with Michael. I'll be sending out tomorrow the recordings. Um, Obviously, though, my day job is I'm an executive recruiter. So if anyone would like to discuss how to choose the right firm, how to negotiate your deal, how to transition properly, please feel free to reach out because that's my expertise. And I thank everybody and thank you again, Michael, and see you next time. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.